Hi, Carlos. This week, I think we're going to go straight to the story. Another young, unarmed black man is shot dead by police in the Minneapolis suburbs, just a few miles from where Derek Chauvin is being tried for the murder of George Floyd.
And hardly surprisingly, it brought people out onto the streets. One sign, written in bright orange letters, captured the mood by asking, during the trial, with a question mark at the end. Mike Griffin is an electoral organizer at the grassroots organization Community Change Action.
You know, it happened again, and I just can't believe it. A young black man, unarmed, once again, killed in the Twin Cities. It could not happen at a more stressful time here in the country, specifically in the Twin Cities here with the trial of Derek Chauvin. The tensions are high. I was outside of the Brooklyn Center precinct today. There were about 2,000 people with me, all chanting for justice. We're looking to fix the systemic policing problems in this country, and that starts with justice for George, but that continues for justice for all the other folks who've been killed.
Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
Welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new show exploring what's shaping America today, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media.
This week, as regular listeners will realize, we're returning to a topic we last covered in December, the actions of the American police. The killing by a police officer of 20-year-old Daunte Wright after he was stopped for a traffic violation suggests little has changed in 2021. Last year, 1,127 people died at the hands of the American police. A huge majority of those were shot. But just 16 police officers were charged. That's only 1%. And even fewer were convicted.
And on average, more than 3 people are killed by the police each day in America. Black and Hispanic people are disproportionately affected. In fact, black people are around 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. In some places, it's much worse than that.
Clearly, there is anger, but there is also some despondency. So today we're asking what needs to change in the justice system so that Americans of color can trust the police, or at least have faith that justice will be served in cases of police brutality.
To get us started on this conversation, I want to introduce you to John Burris. He's a civil rights attorney based in Oakland, California. He's represented some of the best-known victims of police brutality, including Rodney King, whose notorious beating by police officers in 1991 was filmed. The acquittal of 4 policemen in a criminal court sparked the L.A. riots in 1992. Acting for Rodney King in a civil lawsuit against LAPD, John Burris won his client $3.8 million. John, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
John, it's been 30 years since the Rodney King case. How much, as you see what happened in Minnesota, has actually changed?
Well, I'll tell you what's happening in Minnesota. Both the cases in Minnesota, the more recent one as well, is reminiscent of the conduct that has been occurring since Rodney King. I've been involved in hundreds and hundreds of police brutality cases, many shooting cases, and I'm always amazed that there does not appear to be an end in sight. As recent as what happened in Minnesota with this young man that was shot and killed by this police officer. But I'll tell you, since George Floyd's case, I've been involved in at least 7 police shooting cases since then and a number of other cases, and that's just in California. And you can imagine how it is in other states. So I'm not unduly optimistic, but I will tell you this. After George Floyd's homicide, I thought, given the support from the broad-based community, that it might be an opportunity to really develop some movement and some momentum around the question of police reform. I have been involved in seeking reforms in various departments, namely the Oakland Police Department, for a number of years, and I know that reforms can occur, although it does require political will, and it requires community support. But at the end of the day, if the police union and the police chief and the police command staff are not on board, things will not change.
John, during the LA riots back in 1992, Rodney King himself said, we'll get our justice. They've won the battle, but they haven't won the war. Do you think he'd say the same thing today?
I clearly have not. Clearly, the war has not been won, and I think winning the war is more than just the interaction between the police. The war really is the political processes that we exist in today. You can win an individual battle in a local police agency or battles that occur regionally, but in terms of making a systemic impact on the issues of police brutality, to me, that requires the political leaders, and I just don't see that occurring because, to some extent, it almost is so fundamentally ingrained in the American psyche in different communities that are opposed to, ethnic communities getting ahead or making positive steps. In my own view, without being unduly conspiratorial, there's an interest in keeping African Americans down, keeping the police in charge of them, and making sure that their issues do not leak over and branch out into other segments of the community. And then there are people in the community, various communities, I would almost refer to them euphemistically as the Trump people. They're not interested in improving the relationship between the police and the communities, African-American communities at all. So it's a bigger problem. That's when I say winning the war. The war is not won when you have those kind of systemic issues and segments that exist within the communities at large.
John, stay with us because I want to bring in our second guest, Mecole Jordan-McBride. Mecole is an advocacy director at the Policing Project in Chicago, which is a non-profit organization that works across a number of issues, including the use of force and racial profiling. Mecole, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Mecole, I want to ask you in as specific a way as I can, as somebody who watches the American police very closely, what needs to change in the police force in order to minimize these incidents that we're seeing of police brutality?
At the Policing Project, the things that we primarily focus on is front-end accountability or democratic policing, reimagining public safety. And what that means is really thinking about, how police use their time and really broadening the conversation of public safety just meaning more police. More specifically, I think that oftentimes when we think about accountability, we think about back end. What happens once something has already occurred, when someone's life has already been altered? And then we hone in on the individual person or the individual officer and their actions. And less often do we think about what policies were put in place. So you gave a statistic earlier that suggested there's only 1% of officers who are held accountable, if you will. But a lot of times what you see is that the lack of accountability is often placed on the idea that the officer was acting within policy. Who's developing police policies? The fact that the community is not involved in that process is not democratic. The police policies are developed internally and then executed externally. Oftentimes, communities of color feel the heat of that. Being transparent about that, what their mental health supports look like, then we'll actually start having less people traumatized by poor police policy.
Mecole, thank you so much for sharing that, and I appreciate the point you're making about being proactive and not simply reactive. Let me ask you, if you don't mind, what did you feel when you heard about the Daunte Wright case?
I'm cautious about making a statement about that case in particular. I think that it's very reminiscent of the larger problems that we have. What we see is that communities of color are often over-policed and underserved. Just by the nature of how many police are there, you are going to run into more people. It's going to be a larger footprint, and there's a larger chance that a negative interaction can happen. And I think the question of what happened in Minnesota is we have to think about how are we deploying police in communities of color? Is it equitable and is it very responsive to the needs of the community, or is it a response in with lack of talking to the community about what needs they really want and how they would like to see their communities approach public safety?
Mecole, let me bring John back in for a moment. Do you have conversations with folks maybe who are primarily white, who might be strong supporters of, quote, Blue Lives Matter? And if so, what kind of conversation are you having with them about these various police issues? Are they the same ones you were having 30 years ago? Do you sense any change in their perspective?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't have a lot of conversations with Blue Lives Matters, only in the context of litigation. Because in litigation, I'm generally involved in lawsuits against the police departments and police officers. From my point of view, that there is and has been somewhat of a sea change in terms of the awareness that police officers and members of a particular staff officer do engage in proper conduct. And the question is, are you prepared to hold them to answer and hold them to answer for that conduct? I see some of that, but not a lot of that. Certainly, there's a lot that can be done, and I do that in terms of litigation, but that's not the answer to the problem. I mean, I can solve an individual problem, and maybe I can get some systemic changes in a local department, but it doesn't mean anything as it relates to the community and the police next door, or the ones to the left, the one to the north, the one to the south. Those require real discussions among community leaders and people within those individual communities. But right now, what I see is this resistance to that level of discussion. And so it's very disappointing, but I try to maintain optimism to all of this because it does require us to keep thinking forward because times have changed. It is not the same level of discussion that we had with Rodney King or even 30 years before Rodney King, when Martin Luther King was talking about the level of brutality. That doesn't exist on that same level that once did, but that doesn't mean the problem is solved. It just means that we're chipping away.
Mecole, you've described the police in some areas of the United States as more like a heavily armed occupying force. And it does seem that there is this toxic combination of an almost militaristic training combined with racial prejudice. When you look at the training that American police go through, how does it break down in terms of time between the amount of time they're spending on things like community outreach and getting to know people in the community and the amount of time they're spending on learning how to defend themselves and use weapons?
I mean, I think that the lion's share of training is on using a weapon appropriately, which that's important to be able to use a weapon appropriately. But all the paramilitary style of defending a community, very little time is spent on the social emotional aspect of being an officer and engaging with the community. And I think that traditionally speaking, policing has never been, has never even really attracted those who are more, air quote, warm and fuzzy, right? Which is why you don't see as many even women who are officers. At the Policing Project, we just launched an initiative to increase women within policing agencies across the U.S. I think generally speaking, you see women as being more nurturing, able to connect in a more social or emotional way. And we don't have that, right? Men dominate the policing force. And I think that traditionally policing has attracted a certain mindset. We saw people coming home from the military and that being their first job that they would go to. So if this is who we are attracting and this is how we're training, you can't help but to see policing showing up in our communities the way it does. And I think that we do have to have more intentionality about the social, emotional, and the implicit bias, rooting out biases that definitely have an impact in how people show up.
So, Mecole, just to follow up on that, and we should point out that it was a female officer responsible for the killing of Daunte Wright in Minneapolis this week. But where do you stand on the argument around defunding the police? It's become a big argument within the Democratic Party, with some members of Congress saying that the police cannot be reformed. And then on the other hand, you have some Democrats like Jim Clyburn, the sort of elder statesman of the Black caucus in the House of Congress, saying this isn't about policing, this isn't about training, this is about recruiting, and who is recruiting, to the point that you're making. Where do you stand on defunding the police?
I mean, I think that, again, this goes to, some of the work that we've done around reimagining public safety. We have to really think critically about how city and municipality are allocating funds for policing as opposed to every other area of the social structure of the city. How many police are on a force? In Chicago, we have 13,000, right? So what does that look like? How are they using their time? Are they using their time in the most beneficial way? Are they being deployed in the right ways? And I think that the conversation about defunding the police is a larger conversation of, how are we spending money? And if the money that we're investing isn't yielding the results that we want in our communities. And right now, I would say no, right? Because we're still seeing so many people being traumatized at the hands of the police and everything that's happened over the last several years. I think that we have to be able to take a step back and say, well, what is the real return on our investment? Is it yielding the results that we want? And if it's not, how do we really think differently about investing monies so that we can get the real public safety outcomes that the community cries for and deserves?
John, as you hear Mecole talk about the justice and the approach that the community is crying for and deserves, where are our best points of light, to use that old phrase? Where have we seen good progress over the last 30 years? Whether it's been here or around the globe, where could we learn from in order to deliver on what Mecole is calling for?
Well, this is a very important point here because, as discussed earlier, it's a question of resources, number one, but it's also a question of what do you stand for? What are you trying to accomplish? And there are departments, I think, who are trying. And I will say in this whole area, of that 1,200 people who are killed annually, and it's about annual amount, a huge percentage of those are mentally impaired people. And that means to me that the police have not developed a consistent approach on how to de-escalate their contact with mentally impaired people. That's a huge, huge issue because many police officers are not trained or equipped to deal with mentally impaired, and they approach them as felons or people with weapons of any kind and kind of yell and scream at them in ways that they think that a normal, reasonable person would, and it doesn't work. And so from my point of view, departments that have looked more closely at least the mentally impaired person are the more successful ones because that's a significant area. The other area is look at the question of racial profiling. Nothing is more detrimental to me to see African Americans stopped without probable cause, and then one minor event or some attitude can result in them being arrested or, more significantly, having their lives ended. Very much when you think about the minor event that took place in Virginia very recently, where the young military person was stopped and in a very minor way. But basically, the stop was more racial profiling than not. What we then see happens when officers want to stop a Black person, but they really want to search that person and then search their cars. The racial profiling component, that is the basic stop. What did you stop that person for? And whether or not that allows them to ultimately get an arrest of some kind because they didn't like the person's attitude. To me, this is a huge, huge issue. Some departments are looking at those issues. It depends on the department. I think that Obama administration, they had done a very good job at least identifying those departments that seem to have real problems and put forth a pattern and practice that allowed them to monitor that department. Real progress could have been made in that regard. I'm hopeful that in the Biden administration, their Justice Department itself will also take a look at it. Because to some extent, you have to look at the systemic nature of how a department functions. One should never underestimate the culture component of a department. We often have cases where very young officers come in who are very eager and want to do it, male and female. But what happens? As soon as they get through the academy, they run up on these old grizzly officers who tell them, forget about what you learned in the academy. This is how we do it here. That's a challenge. But one thing I always know that bothers me is that in Europe, they don't necessarily have guns, but they are also people that they confront who have knives. And they disarm these people on a routine basis. Whereas in the United States, if you have a knife and you're confronted by the police, chances are you're going to be killed by that police officer, particularly if you're an African American. And so that's a huge issue for me. But I think we can learn a lot from some of the European countries who have learned to disarm individuals with weapons and not cause that person to be killed, because we really do want to save lives and we do want to make sure people don't go to jail for crimes that could have been avoided.
John, you raised such an interesting point because in the UK last year, 5 people were killed by police. And that's all compared to 1,127 here in the United States. There is a huge disparity.
I saw that data.
I'm so glad that you brought up the case of Lieutenant Nazario. And if our listeners haven't seen that video that was caught on the body cameras of the police, it is really worth looking at that traffic stop. John, you raised this issue of humiliation, and Lieutenant Nazario was pepper sprayed by the police, but he was also deliberately humiliated and thrown to the ground and reduced to tears.
We see that often. You know, I have just a case, a 17-year-old kid, this is a month ago, riding in a place called Stockton, California, speeding late at night, but he didn't want to stop on a lonely road, so he pulls up to try to stop. The police ultimately do stop him. As he's trying to tell them, put his hands on the steering wheel, the police yank him out of the car and beat him unmercifully. And we have a tape of that. This is what happens on a routine basis, but most people don't know about it because if you don't have the video camera and you're not a public figure, nobody will know. And so that's the disturbing part of policing. It's the cases that happen on a routine basis that you don't know about, that create a lot of harm, and they undermine the relationship between the community and the police, because those individuals who are stopped and harassed, they will never, ever forget it. And they will transmit that on to their friends, to their neighbors, to their kids. And what you basically have is this conflict that exists between the community and the police, which the police don't do a good job of trying to correct in most places.
We do like to try to find hope, even in the darkest places on this program. So we wondered if there is room for optimism in this story. Professor Gloria Brown Marshall of John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York told us what she thought.
They're looking for positivity in what? Where? How do you see positivity? It's always this sense that Black people are supposed to be the hopeful ones, no matter what insanity white people place at our doorstep. White people have been allowed to murder people of color without any criminal consequence. And so we're in the 21st century and white people are still killing people of color with impunity. And they're doing it because they can get away with it. Because it's happened so often with over 1,000 people killed by police, not just people of color. White people are being killed by police as well. But because it's assumed that this is a black and white problem, the solutions for it really haven't been addressed. Our policing began as slave catchers and militia to put down Native American uprisings. If we don't recognize that history and then try to create mechanisms to address it, then we're going to be in the same situation year after year after year. And I think it sends a horrific message to the rest of the world that this so-called shining light of democracy is got so much blood running through the streets.
Mecole, as you hear that, and I know your daughter's thought about possibly becoming a cop or a firefighter, how do you take in what the professor was sharing?
I mean, I think this is so much truth to it. It's, policing, when we think about the historical context of it, you can't deny it. And I think that so often society or America wants to move on without acknowledging the failures and the historical context. And I don't think that it's fair. As with when the civil rights movement happened, more people are acknowledging the stories and the experiences of Black America because of the advent of more cameras. You can't deny it when it's in your face, right? I mean, even right now when we're looking at George Floyd, it was because of so many cameras and live streaming, people can't deny it. And I think that there is no moving forward in a real way without a strong acknowledgement of that failure. It should not be incumbent on Black Americans to say, okay, well, we're going to just put the past behind us and move forward. I think that it takes all of us to be able to move forward. We have to be able to figure out what life looks like in the future and acknowledge not only the history, but then all the other things that kind of lead to the over-policing of our communities. But we only want to focus on one aspect of it, right? We only want to focus on one piece. And I think it's a part of a larger puzzle of structural racism that policing definitely plays a hand in. It's not on us to say that this needs to be fixed. It's on everyone to say, these are problems. How do we own them and fix them moving forward? And yes, my daughter does want to be, law enforcement. My husband is in law enforcement, and she looks up to that. As I'm raising her to say, you could be whatever you want to be. And if you want to go in law enforcement, amen, go for it. But I think that the historical context of it has to be acknowledged, and we have to do a better job at making sure we're recruiting in the right places, we're giving the right supports, and we're actually giving the right training to deal with the things in our communities and be able to help those who are in our communities be able to thrive and not just survive.
John, let me take that same question to you with your years of experience in this field. How do you respond to the professor's suggestion that this is not a time to be looking for positivity?
Well, basically, I'm an optimistic person generally. And the reason being is that I can't do this continued work representing people constantly if I have a negative attitude toward it. I only look from a historical point of view, and that keeps me sort of balanced. It's a long ways from where it used to be in terms of how policing took care of the community, where there was no responsibility that could be had. There are now, since I've been a lawyer, you can, in fact, do something about it as an individual. And you can hold departments accountable. You can hold individuals accountable. That's a tool that we have that other generations didn't have. However, in the last 30 years, since Rodney King, now we have much more foreseeability, much more insight, much more ability to visualize what police are doing. And as a consequence of that, police then are in a position where the mirror is turned on them, and they can see what we all know now, which they always knew. And so given there's knowledge here, it seems to me that there's opportunity trying to improve the situation. I recognize that it's a cultural question, but I also think, and I tell folks, the situation is not going to be resolved in sort of my lifetime per se. But like every generation, you have to move the social agenda forward. You have to be willing to take chances and to do things, hopefully, but it's not relying upon the goodness of people per se. You have to make people do it. I'm a firm believer in John Lewis's thing that you have to make people uncomfortable and you have to get in the way. Now, that's not a short-term solution here. And I also view it in a much larger problem. It's not just policing that we're looking at here. You have to look at the economy, the educational system, employment areas, because what you're really doing is producing people that if you don't have opportunity, you're going to be brought in the crosshairs of police where they're in a position to keep the community safe and sound and to deal with gangsters and all of which have to be done. But from my point of view, progress can be made. I think that protest is important, organizing people and confronting the political leaders, because that's how you're going to bring about change. When people have to do it, even though they don't want to do it, that's a very positive step forward. It's not short steps, but it is a step that I think has to be taken to move forward.
John Burris, Mecole Jordan-McBride, thank you both so very much, both for the work that you're doing and for joining Katty and me today.
We asked at the beginning of the program how people were feeling about this moment and whether there was a sense of anger or a sense of despair. And I think I heard in both their voices an exhaustion at dealing with this.
I can't even imagine the heartbreak if you're Daunte Wright's family. Obviously, the trauma, as Mecole talked about, is all too real. I think so many of us saw the notice, and you almost kind of think to yourself, how is that possible? And but as John Burris said, you have to stay engaged. There has to be a level of optimism, because if not, we won't make the improvements that have to be made.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe.